Hello from the first week of August, just a few days after the legislature wrapped most formal business. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, which is CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. And I am joined today, delightfully, here in our studio, very, very close to the Golden Dome over on Beacon Hill, which means we can hear just how little is happening over there right now, by my colleague Chris Lisinski. Chris, hello. Why are we both allegedly slightly less tired than we usually are at this stage in July?
Because the legislature kept going until only about 11:20, 11:30 p.m. on the last night of sessions, not until 10 a.m. the following morning.
That's properly bedtime. I'm really happy for them. I do recall House Speaker Ron Mariano making a joke earlier in the day that it was going to be basically a normal workday and he probably wouldn't be up until 3 a.m. It's a little bit of a joke, but why, in fact, am I making jokes about 3 a.m., 9 a.m.? July 31st just lasts until the end of July 31st, right?
According to the normal laws of time, yes, but this is the Massachusetts legislature. A friend of ours dubs them Lords of Time, or Time Lords. Lawmakers have a pattern of leaving lots of business for themselves until the very last minute possible. And in 2022 and in 2024, on July 31st, those sessions stretched all the way until the calendar flipped to August 1st and then some. Those last formal sessions of the terms in each of the past two cycles went well past sunrise the following morning because legislative leaders were scrambling to finish so many of their priorities that they left lingering until the very end, and in some cases did not finish even at the very end. This time was different. They set out some new rules from the very beginning that said July 31st does not mean exactly what it used to. So yes, it is still a big deadline. Yes, it is still a last day of summer camp vibe under the Golden Dome, but it's not the final big inflection point for most of the most important things that we track up on Beacon Hill.
That's right, because when you think about kind of the normal cycle of the legislative session, so it's this 2-year cycle, but really the panic starts to rise as you get into the spring and early summer at the end of that 2-year cycle, even though technically speaking, the session does not end until the end of December, but they try and basically approach it with the energy of a grad student who remembers that something is done the night before, and they kind of try and push through as many of the major things as possible. But they have decided not to do that, as we have been alluding to, because they actually changed their rules this year. They still do have to get some stuff done by the end of July 31st, but not everything. And then they have a few months where they can kind of just work through things. Is that roughly right?
Exactly. The simplest way to think of it is anything controversial that will require a roll call vote or getting something through not unanimously needs to have cleared both the House and the Senate in some form by July 31st. They can use the ensuing 5 months to negotiate any differences, come to compromise on a final bill to send to Governor Healy. That might happen a week from now. It might happen on January 5th, 2027 at 11:47 p.m. Both of those are entirely possible, but the key here is that it no longer needs to be done before the final gavel rings on July 31st.
So basically what it means now is we get something of a sense about what's sort of still on the table, because anything that might still need to be kind of hashed out, negotiated between the House and the Senate, need to at least make it into what are called conference committees, which are groups of a few legislators from each house that sit down and try and figure out what a final version of that bill looks like. Or if they feel creative, they want to split it into different bills, if nothing comes out. Basically, anything that goes into those committees by July 31st can then sort of show up in a final form at some point over the next few months, get handed over to Governor Healy, and then that is when we will decide and find out what they have been doing for the entire remainder of that time.
Exactly. And as is very often the case with the legislature, there won't be much notice. We will find out that this team that's been negotiating, say, the sweeping economic development bill has a deal probably about 24 hours before they take the final votes to send it to Governor Healy. And we'll find out what's in it maybe a few hours after they say they have a deal. So there's nothing prescribed. There are not specific mile markers along the way or interim deadlines along the way. It really is now a 5-month span with a lot of question marks, and deals will just pop up along the way.
So let's get into kind of what that last, not even race to the finish, but just race to get things in by the end of July actually looked like here. There were a few really, really big bills that basically made it past that threshold in the last week of July. So what stood out to you most?
Yeah, we talk about economic development because that is a big one. It happens every few years. Lawmakers love to do what they call a jobs bill. It has really developed into something of a grab bag because it has bond authorization. So the state borrows money to fund a whole host of workforce development, infrastructure projects, so on and so forth. It's also where lawmakers usually try to slide in any stray ideas they've had for a while, have been pushing for a while, but never really succeeded at getting into a different vehicle. So that's one that got into negotiations, and it could be quite some time before we see what happens with it. The other really big one that we saw just at the very end of sessions was primary care reforms. We've talked a lot about the crisis state of primary care in Massachusetts, how virtually impossible it is to find a new doctor if you don't have an existing PCP, how long you have to wait to get an appointment, and both branches now definitely want to do something about it. What they want to do about it, we'll find out weeks or months from now, but the House followed the Senate's lead and approved some legislation in the closing days, so that's in negotiations as well. The third one that I think we saw right at the death was the Senate's version of a public records reform bill that is tied together, responding with, superseding a ballot question on the same topic, but that now heads into negotiations from which it will emerge at a point TBD.
Yeah, we'll get into the public records one in a little bit because that's sort of part of, I guess, what we'd consider the weird ones in this legislative cycle. But you raised a few things that I'd like to dive into a little bit. And one of them is the economic development bill is huge, sweeping, massive, both the original provisions and the amendments proposed, many of which were accepted, many of which were kind of tossed out in bundles. You know, you're dealing with thousands of different provisions and lines and policies in this bill. And one of the things that might sound familiar when we talk about how meaningful these kind of omnibus pieces of legislation are is that the very controversial MBTA communities housing law that everyone's been up in arms about for the past few years, that came in through an economic development bill, just a few lines in there. And
that was an amendment that got snuck into the bill at, I want to say, 11 p.m. and had maybe 3 sentences of description from one senator. And that's it. That was all of the debate about it. And then it became law. And then we saw what happened from there.
Yeah. And now we have sort of, a few years later, a follow-up economic development bill that's also trying to do some things in the housing space. But interestingly, they've, talked about them a bit more at length, even though they're all sort of rolled into this economic development bill package. So depending on if you're looking at the housing side, I guess the housing side in general, but the House side or the Senate side of it, you might be looking at something like provisions making it easier to build housing on religiously owned property. That's this YIGBY, yes in God's backyard policy. Or you might be thinking about this kind of sweeping proposal that will essentially upzone the entire state by making duplexes legal as kind of a base thing on any residential lot. Those are both in separate versions of the bill. So they might both make it out of conference committee. One of them might make it out of conference committee. We may never know why one of them does or doesn't survive. But I am curious, Chris, looking at the way that these sort of large bills end up kind of carrying very disparate policy proposals through there. Is this something that lawmakers describe as kind of an effective, efficient use of legislation, or would they rather be doing kind of individual tailored bills?
I think it depends who you ask in the legislature. Legislative leaders seem to love omnibus bills, especially over the past 5 to 6 years. This has become much more the norm to do one big healthcare bill, one big economy bill, so on and so forth, rather than having members come in every week and doing 20 smaller bills on disparate topics. So legislative leaders love it. in some ways, it's a negotiation tactic. It's a political tactic. Tie together a whole bunch of things, many of which lawmakers want. They're less inclined to vote against the one or two things they don't want because they don't want to see the whole package go down. Rank and file lawmakers are probably mixed on it because, again, if they have ideas, they might prefer for their idea for one single zoning change to float on its own rather than be tied together with something that also is so much more complex and then takes longer to finalize and to finish. So I'd say emotions are pretty mixed about it, but omnibus bills like this are very, very much the way of the road at this point.
So that's what made it in kind of at the last minute. What made it in a little bit earlier? What's actually made it all the way to the governor?
Yeah, a few very significant things are already on the governor's desk waiting for her review. We saw compromise action on immigration protection legislation, the so-called PROTECT Act. That's been a big storyline for more than a year, essentially the entire term, as President Donald Trump has returned to the White House and as federal immigration authorities have ramped up their deportation efforts. So the governor is reviewing that, could sign it in the coming days. Lawmakers in the final week of their business also sent her a bill to take Norwood Hospital, the shuttered Norwood Hospital facility, by eminent domain, part of a bigger effort to get something operating at that site. I think it's been idle for 5 or 6 years since it had a flood.
Yep.
And we also saw lawmakers send Healy a bill changing the rules for abortions late in pregnancy, essentially removing the conditions that were in state law and saying it will just be up to a doctor and a patient. Those are the only two who need to be consulted on abortions after 24 weeks.
We've also got some kind of interesting examples of a creative approach to even a smaller, seemingly more tailored bill can find ways to have other things jammed into it. And the example that sort of comes to mind here that made it in a few weeks before the end of session was this cell phone in schools bill that then ended up with something else on there. So walk me through where we were with cell phones in schools first.
That's right. The Senate has approved legislation that would simply limit cell phones in schools, something called a bell-to-bell ban. It's an issue that a lot of teachers have been calling for action on for years now. The House took that bill and said, okay, what if we ban cell phones in schools? And as part of the exact same legislative vehicle, what if we also create sweeping new regulations for social media use by minors? Both of these deal with kids and phones in some way. Surely that should be the same legislation, shouldn't it? The Senate did social media regulations for minors in its own standalone legislation, but that standalone bill never went anywhere in the House. I know this all sounds a little arcane and crazy, but really what it means is if lawmakers are going to agree to this vehicle that is in conference committee, the cell phone bill, is really the only remaining option for them to do, at least in this legislative term. They might have to come back fresh in 2027 and start from the very beginning, or they might just have to accept, our cell phone bill is also a social media bill. This is how it's going to go.
And so when we were talking about this in the newsroom earlier, kind of this funny period that we're entering here where the conference committees are sort of operating as black boxes, you could end up with a few different things that come out of this cell phone ban bill and also the social media language. Yeah. You could have a bill that just takes some of it and that's all of it alone. Everybody just goes, okay, we're going to deal with cell phones. It's nice, it's clean, we've put it out, we've agreed on language. That's one thing. They could do, as you noted, kind of a combo bill, which does sort of deal more with what the House has proposed and say we're doing both of these things at the same time. Or they might even be able to, say, send some version of it out of conference earlier around the cell phone bills, and then we don't really hear anything about it for a while, and then there could be a completely separate bill on social media legislation as well. So when you're trying to explain to people what this kind of odd, informal period actually looks like in terms of what you can expect, how much insight anyone would have over the final form of something that comes out, is it just guessing? Is it gambling?
It is largely a guessing game. Yeah, folks like myself and like you, we will be asking lawmakers anytime we see them for updates, but especially when it comes to these House-Senate negotiations, they do not like to discuss the status. They do not like to discuss what the holdups are for any of these talks. So it really just becomes a waiting game and a guessing game. And as is so often the case with the legislature, they can mostly do what they want. They have rules that will guide the way this unfolds, and the rules are different than they were in the past, so this will unfold differently than in the past. But if the Speaker and Senate President want to do a social media bill, they'll find a way to do it. We don't know what it looks like, but they'll find a way.
And I guess one thing that comes to mind based on that social media bill is part of what's made the history and kind of the trajectory of it so funny, interesting, complicated, is that the governor's also been weighing in on this one. So we actually have 3 different proposals around what, say, social media restrictions could look like. Anywhere from a basic ban for people under a certain age to variants including limits on how late you could, allow a child to be receiving messages or notifications. And when I say child, I mean preteen, heading into bad decision-making territory. And then some of them that are saying, well, you don't want to get alerts after a certain hour. You basically should or shouldn't be taking X into account if you know that this person is a child. So all of this is to say, where, if anywhere, has the governor been or will the governor be in the legislative deliberation process? Because she's been out there saying, I'd like them to move faster on energy affordability, for instance. So she's present, but she's not in those same rooms.
Yeah, she's not a party to the negotiations between the House and Senate. It's a really good question, and it's kind of a complicated answer. We saw last week the governor go out of her way to hold an event on the last day for formal lawmaking business, essentially to renew pressure on lawmakers to get to a deal on energy affordability legislation that she filed, 15 months ago at this point. She's still waiting, and as election day draws nearer, she's probably getting antsy for a final product she can point to. So neither she nor her team are actually involved in the talks between the House and Senate. They might consider her feedback, but she's not really that much of a power player in what they decide to do on these bills.
And I guess this brings us to the category that I alluded to as the weird ones, which is basically, as you all might be familiar listening to this, we are roaring rapidly toward November, which is not just when you elect people to serve in office, but also when, if all things go as they seem to be going, you will also get to vote on 9 different ballot questions. And 2 of those ballot questions were thrown out entirely by the state's high court, so nobody has to deal with those right now. And another 2 are actually the subject of sort of counteracting legislation. How would you describe the fate currently of the public records question?
Can we take the next 20 minutes to unpack this? How much time do we have?
Right, exactly. No, this is a good note, Chris. So on a very broad sense, starting with public records, right? This is a ballot measure that is pushed by Diana DeZoglio, who of course successfully pushed for the not at all controversial, I'm kidding, very controversial. There are many fights in the legislature over this ballot question about auditing the legislature. This is a different one. This one would specifically say, hey, we have a public records law here in Massachusetts. Most parts of our government are open to it, but the legislature, the governor, and the judiciary are all specifically exempted, and this would say that is no longer the case. The governor and the legislature would have to follow, generally speaking, the same public records law as any other city or town official. Now, that's the ballot question. Lawmakers have decided to wade into it.
Yes. Lawmakers do not seem to like the ballot question. They seem to think that it would raise some constitutional issues because the current framework has the Secretary of State's office, which is part of the executive branch, overseeing public records compliance and ordering different government entities to comply. Lawmakers say, hey, executive branch cannot do that to the legislative branch. The Constitution outlines a separation of powers. We're not comfortable with that. Coincidentally, they also don't want their correspondence to become public. So the House and Senate both have bills in play that would write an entirely new way for the legislature to comply with the public records law. They would be complying with some version of the public records law, to be clear, under their legislation. It's just different than what all other government entities already face. Now, here's the really, really weird part, the weird, tricky timing. Both of those are live right now with the ballot question already locked in for November. No matter what happens, voters are going to get a chance to decide on that ballot question. And because of the way lawmakers sequenced their action, they might report a bill out and approve a bill before the election or after the election that features language seemingly designed to supersede whatever happens at the ballot. Legislative leaders will not say this directly. They're not being particularly forthcoming about it, but talk to lawyers. They take a look at the bill text and they have said, yeah, it sure seems like this sentence here describing the legislature's proposal as the sole and exclusive remedy would render the ballot question moot. So that was a little more information than your call for a succinct answer, but I think that's the best we can do.
I'm honestly happy with it. It is funny. I'm thinking about actually Governor Healy was asked recently about a few of these ballot measures and was asked on GBH News, basically, well, would you vote in favor of this public records ballot measure? And she said, that seems fine with me, but then said she didn't really know what was going on in the legislature with their bills. So those are sort of on parallel tracks. Kind of confusing. We also have another one that's happening on parallel tracks, which is trying to sort of circumvent a proposed ballot measure that would change the formula by which the state decides if it has too much revenue that it brings in through taxes every year, it might have to then give some back to the citizens. And so generally speaking, this is a very rarely enacted provision. It's only happened once while I've been covering Massachusetts. And so the ballot measure that's put forward would basically change the formula in such a way that it would make it more likely to trigger more often. So now the lawmakers looking at that coming down the pike would like to also adjust that formula.
Maybe. And again, the uncertainty here really, I think, is the key. There's no guarantee that they do this. There's no guarantee that they advance public records legislation that supersedes the ballot. It's just a possibility. And because we're in this stretch where everything is a black box for the next 5 months, we're left scratching our heads. And as a result, voters are left scratching their heads. So on 62F, the Senate added language to its economic development bill, essentially adding a new test to say when these refunds would be triggered. I won't get into the very arcane math that goes into it, but suffice it to say that if this new test existed and the ballot question passed, there would be fewer refunds owed to taxpayers than just if the ballot question passed. It's really a way to take the edge off what voters might do without outright repealing it or ignoring it. We don't know if the House is going to go along with this in talks. House Speaker Ron Mariano has acknowledged that messing with Chapter 62F, the tax cap law, might be politically risky at a time when voters are also thinking about changes to the law. But lawmakers do things that are politically risky all the time. So maybe it'll happen. Maybe it'll happen before the election. Maybe it'll happen after the election. We really don't know, and that is essentially the crux of the storyline for the next few months.
And they very much did not have to make a decision on another potential tax issue, which would have basically reduced the income tax rate. To put it in as simple as possible terms here, that was one of the ballot measures that I alluded to earlier that the Supreme Judicial Court booted from the ballot, basically in this case saying that the Attorney General's summary of the measure was actually inaccurate, and so it can't go before voters given that. But they didn't have to actually figure out kind of a way to engage with the income tax measure and their usual rhythm, which is a ballot measure is a law like any other ballot measure. So even if it might be politically unpopular, if a ballot measure goes into effect, lawmakers could come back and say, well, we're changing the law. We're allowed to do that by the people that elected us and that voted for the ballot measure, funnily enough.
It's worth us underlining that. There is nothing legally questionable about this. A ballot question is just a state law. Lawmakers can change state law. It's their job. The the issue is a political one, not
Right.
a legal one.
No, absolutely. And so I think to kind of put a bit of a point or a button on this note here, there were plenty of sort of spots along the process during a normal ballot question cycle when lawmakers might be interacting with these questions. Do we pass them? Do we try and coordinate campaign against those passing, like in a kind of just straightforward oppositional sense? Do we try to work toward a compromise or a bargain? They didn't do any of those on these two measures, right? These are kind of independent legislative attempts to kind of end run possibly around those ballot
And
questions.
they're independent legislative attempts that surfaced after the order of questions was already locked in on the ballot. So proponents of the ballot questions didn't even have the opportunity to cease their campaigns and take the question off the ballot, even if they wanted to.
Right. Okay, so dealt with that. I think the other one that's kind of funny, more in the category of what is not happening, is another potential ballot measure, which would have instated a strict rent control all across the state. That was also booted by the Supreme Judicial Court. This one for totally separate reasons. It brought religion into it. That is not allowed for a ballot measure. The SJC cut that off. So that also means that in theory, because the legislature did have a number of rent control proposals and some compromise language in front of it, that if they'd wanted to, they could have, worked it in for the session, but they do not want to do that.
They do not want to.
We assume rent control is dead this session. Okay.
I think that is a safe bet, given that there's no leverage that rent control proponents have over lawmakers, at least until next year at the earliest.
And so what else to you is sort of, again, big old caveat here, they can do whatever they want until the end of the year if they can muster up the will for it, the votes for it. What else is just not happening or does not seem to be happening?
I don't think there's going to be any push to regulate the use of artificial intelligence in campaigns. This was something that had surfaced earlier in the year. Republican candidate for governor Brian Shortsleeve was circulating an ad with a fake AI-generated Maura Healey quote, was not based on reality. The House approved legislation setting some new guardrails around how AI can be used in election communications, in election ads. Never came up for a vote in the Senate, so almost certainly that's dead until at least 2027, 2028, barring some unforeseen, tricky legislative maneuver to revive it. Another thing that seems really DOA is a very recent proposal from the governor to earmark some forward-looking surtax revenue to give another little jolt to cities and towns to help pay for schools. She wanted to do another $100 million for K-12 education. That bill never moved in the weeks since she filed it before the July 31st deadline. And from what we've heard, at least in the House, it seems like legislative leaders are pretty skeptical about that idea.
And one of the things you mentioned AI, another funny thing about the economic development bill, we're just going to keep coming back to that, meatball, if I'm going to describe it the way that Elizabeth Warren described the housing bill that passed in Congress recently. There is language in the Senate's provision, but not in the House's version that would create basically new regulations for AI companies. That was something that both chambers were considering, but ultimately didn't surface in the House one. So, like everything else, that might mean that one chamber doesn't want to do it, so it won't make it through into the final bill because everybody has to get on board, or it could be a tool or a leverage opportunity to try and get something in. So AI is still on the table in that nothing is ever off the table.
Eco-dev, it could be just a jobs bill. It could also be a housing bill and an AI bill and a tax policy bill and a juvenile jurisdiction bill. We'll find out.
Historical horse racing is in that bill.
Right. Betting
On historical horse racing. Yeah. There's an entire sort of provision as well in there that they call the fun agenda. So, Senator Julian Sear is making a play to bring back happy hour again. There's some stuff in there about fortune tellers. I don't know why the speaker made a reference to bingo the other day, but it is a huge, huge sprawling bill. And technically, I guess the thread connecting it is, there's a commercial component to a lot of this stuff.
Money.
Yeah. That's what makes it an eco-dev bill. So I think that kind of takes us to maybe the look back, look ahead. what we were told going into this sort of end of formal business phase, essentially, is that it would be less chaotic, more manageable, more transparent. As you've been trying to keep an eye on things, has it felt less harried? Has it been easier to track? What's that been like?
Yeah, it has been less harried. I think the key takeaway for me is that it is and it isn't an improvement. People were out of the building by midnight. They were not there until the sun rose the next morning. I think what legislative leaders did properly was set expectations. It was pretty clear to those of us in the press, and therefore pretty clear to everyone watching, that this was not going to be a race to get everything done. It was going to be a race to get the important things into House Senate talks. They did that. There's no contention that they did that. Where I think it is still not quite a perfect system, it's not at maximum efficiency, is, like we keep saying, no one knows what the next 5 months will look like. They will most likely get to deals on all of the dozen bills that are in conference committees, but the structure of that has not changed at all. There are huge questions at play, and it will really just be up to 3 representatives, 3 senators with buy-in from their bosses, deciding in a closed room, yeah, this is the final version, yes to AI regulations, no to AI regulations, and giving their colleagues 24 to 48 hours notice to do a single up or down vote on it. So it has not transformed the underlying process, but it is more efficient and took out some of the chaos that really didn't serve anyone by being there.
It was and has been interesting watching you, and particularly also our colleague Jordan Woolman, who covers energy policy, which is another just massive, hotly debated question right now, is essentially, that a lot of the coverage is sort of on the front end. It's as you sort of see these bills surface in their individual chambers, as you see kind of the governor propose her version of something, and then the question of what horses get traded down the line just is not clear until after the fact. So exactly. I think I'm sort of in agreement with you in terms of, it's very kind of transparent and open sort of until it's not. And I think that brings me to my last, if someone wants to know what the calendar is from here on out, are we going to see a sudden flurry of open hearings about all of these bills? I say with that tone.
No.
Yeah.
I think more likely than not is these 12 or so bills that are in negotiations will just suddenly emerge when they're done with them. It might be a week from now. It might be 4.5 months from now. They might try to time it so that 3 bills come out of conference at the same time so they can tackle all of those with one session instead of needing 12 sessions. I get that. There's 200 lawmakers. They come from all over the state. It makes sense to try and stack that together where you can. But we just don't know. There might be hearings if the governor files a new spending bill, but that's about it. That's about the only very visible lawmaking we will see from here until the new term starts in next January. And we should note, the last thing on this is the July 31st deadline is not something that we came up with. It's not something that's in state law. It's not in the state constitution. It is a rule that lawmakers set for themselves 3 decades ago because their predecessors had engaged in some pretty shady, lame duck lawmaking with quid pro quos, and they said, you know what, going forward, let's take big business out of election season so that there's not an incentive to do that again. Here we are. It's going to be election season, and lawmakers are still making big decisions.
Right. Making big decisions, and of course also it's ballot question season as well. So it's a sort of unusual experience where you're going to watch a very transparent example of kind of democratic processes, for good and for ill, depending on your positioning on that, happening through the ballot measures, where you're going to get a pretty clear sense of where every community ended up landing on any of these ballot measures. We're going to start in the next month or so getting a sense of the financing that comes with them. So all of these things happening in parallel has made it a very unusual year given the sheer number of ballot questions, which is tying our all-time record, at the same time as lawmakers move a bit more methodically and efficiently, but then sort of dip out of that transparency space. So all of that in mind. Any other notes, Chris? We good? Happy special episode.
Happy special episode. This was a lot of fun, and happy August. Over under on how many lawmakers you will see in the next month.
I plead the fifth.
That's the correct answer.
It is. So thank you again, Chris, of course, for being here. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is by Charlie Cazella. Leave us a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us. And if you want to email us, if you know what lawmakers are doing during these next 5 months, email us at codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org, and we will be back next week.